Hi, everybody. I wanted to jump on today and share with you some answers to questions that we get quite often. So now and then, we'll get the question that one of our clients or one of our new clients has heard the benefits of chiropractic care with school age kids when it comes to focus, attention, anxiety, and overall school performance. And often we get the question of how on earth can chiropractic have any sort of effect on that? So, along with our plan of action with chiropractic care, we talk through with parents and families the benefits of getting outside and active play and nutrition and other ways to help a child's brain work. But when it comes down to it, we got to get back to neurology and help to make the brain and central nervous system work the way that it's supposed to. So, what I wanted to chat with you today is how that happens. And the best way to do that is to look at how the need for chiropractic care comes up in anyone, and then specifically if there's a presence of that subluxation or that fixation and misalignment within the spine of a child in that age group, what effect does it have on the central nervous system? So I put together a couple slides that I'll share with you now on what that stuff is and how chiropractic may be able to help in many situations. There we go. So when we look at the process of, we're looking at ADHD, sensory processing, anxiety, and what we call the busy brain. How that all works is we go back to the beginning. We look at, this study is a good example, but childbirth, for those who have been involved with it, either on the mom side, the dad side, or the baby side, it is not a cakewalk for anyone involved. It is very traumatic physically, emotionally, and many times chemically. So all of those inputs into the nervous system, as this paper says, 99% of the time results in some fixation and misalignment somewhere in that baby's spine. So when they looked at asymptomatic newborns, so brand new babies that had no problems, they found that 99 out of 100 of those had some issues within the spine. And when that happens, that has an impact on the central nervous system underneath. So when we look at after the birth process, what can then play in to create that fixation and misalignment if it's not the birth process? So if you were that lucky one that was the 1 out of 100 that didn't have birth trauma that caused these things, what else can go on? So let's remember that the central nervous system's job is to integrate about 11 million pieces of information per second pertaining to our internal and external environments, prioritize all that stuff, and then tell your whole body what to do. So in that, all day, every day, you really have 3 stresses that you're dealing with, or 3 types of stress. Those are physical, chemical, emotional. So the big ones that we talked about with birth trauma is very obvious, is the physical trauma. So that can be inside while your baby is carried inside the womb or in the process of exiting, plus then childhood in general, being in car seats, regular childhood traumas, all of those things. So after physical stress, we have chemical stress. This is one that we often like to ignore because we want life to taste good and be really convenient, but this includes environmental toxins, food sensitivities, dietary constraints, and then after the chemical stress, we look at psycho-emotional stress. This, unfortunately, if anybody takes an honest look at it, it is a lot harder to be a kid today than it ever has been before. It's much easier for me as a child back in the 80s than it is now. So we look at everything from mom's psycho-emotional state during pregnancy. How mom is wired at the end of pregnancy is how baby is wired at the beginning of life. Then we get into the birth process itself, oftentimes being separated from mom in a very sterile environment, sometimes for an extended period of time. Plus then after you're home and going through childhood, the psycho-emotional state of the household in general has a big impact. And then if there are big events, whether that's family events, loss of a loved one, separation, divorce, these things all have big impacts too on how things are going with the child, and that ramps up the psycho-emotional stress load for that child. Because there are all 3 of these, whenever one is really, really high, your propensity or adaptability to others is quite low. So it doesn't necessarily mean you have to have a really bad situation in all 3. At various times in your childhood or in your child's childhood, if one is really, really high, it may not be all that much in the others that causes this massive change and massive influx of noxious stimuli into the central nervous system that your body has to deal with. So really stressful times make it to where you don't necessarily need a huge physical trauma to create change. Or if nutrition and overall chemistry and household environment is rough nutritionally, then, emotionally stressful loads may be low, but still creating some significant issues. And then if we look at the physical traumas, if somebody's looking at if they've had birth trauma or just being a regular kid and had some traumas along the way, and then are spending some significant time with tablets or phones and things like that, and creating a significant amount of postural loads on the neck, then chemical and psycho-emotional may not need to be so big to create a big change. Long story short, it's different for each child how much of a stress load is needed and of what kind to create what can be a very, very significant neurological state moving forward. So physical, chemical, emotional stress, we have all three every day. Everybody does. Your body can take a whole bunch up to the point where it can't. At that time, there's an adaptation that takes place. We end up with this misalignment and fixation. You can picture your spine and that of your child as the electrical panel in your house. When the stress on the system builds, the breaker flips. And when that happens, the brain and the body no longer communicate the way that they're supposed to, and that child's health is not exactly as it should be from that point forward. So the breaker panel, as I mentioned here, I know this is most likely too small for you to see, but when there is subluxation within the spine, or that fixation and misalignment, we're losing proper motion in the spine, and therefore then we're losing proper information from that area of the spine to the brain about how that person's body is moving in its environment. When it gets fixated and stuck, or subluxated as we refer to it, the outgoing information from the brain to the body can also be diminished or altered. And what the breaker panel analogy shows us here is that certain pathways go to certain areas. So for example, if we go back to that study that we talked about, where with the fixation and misalignment in asymptomatic newborns, many of those times they're talking about the upper neck. And if you can imagine, most babies come out head first. There's many times, unfortunately, more and more as we go forward, some intervention there where whoever's facilitating that birth might have to use a bit of force to get baby out. And we have some examples here as we move forward that I'll refer to in just a second. But this chart shows on the left, what levels of the spine that we have. The middle column is where do those nerves go? And then on the right, what can go on in the body when those are affected? So that's something that's quite detailed. Check with your chiropractor. Most of them have this type of stuff with us. We keep these handouts ready. We also have this as a poster on the wall. So you can kind of see this, reading it from the left to the right or from the right to the left, to see neurologically what area of the spine has impacts on what level of physiology and what specific actions the central nervous system is responsible for. But the big thing that happens as a byproduct of that flip of the breaker panel, or that subluxation process, is the lack of motion. Things get stuck. We have dyskinesia, which is just a fancy way to saying things aren't working right. Lack of or abnormal motion. For some reason in healthcare, we think if we say it in Latin, it makes us sound so much smarter. So dyskinesia is where we start. When we start that way with dyskinesia, well, here's a good example of why that happens. Even a normal vaginal delivery where there's, pristine birth story of birds chirping in the background and scented oils and everything like that, and fairies dancing around, is about 27 pounds of pressure on the head and neck of a newborn baby. If there are any sort of interventions, then that goes up to a significant degree very quickly. Vacuum extraction doubles that up to 50 pounds, as it shows here. Forceps can be up to 70. So picture that amount of force or intervention put on a child that's a couple days old. You'd be horrified. The police would be called. Somebody would be going to jail over that. But in the birth process, we understand that baby needs to get out. So these forces are necessary in some situations in order to get baby out. But we cannot forget that that happened, and we cannot forget that the mess needs to be cleaned up. We have to do something to counteract what has been done in the birth process. The next step, we look at this. I'll skip over that one for now. What happens then when we lose proper motion? As it says, decreased proprioception leads to increased nociception. So as we move, our body's always sending information to our brain about where we are in space, so that our brain, our central nervous system, can take that information about where we are and combine it with those other pieces of information from our sight, sound, touch, taste, smell to create an internal model of how safe we are at any given time. Remember, we're dealing with some ancient neurology. We've been around a long time, and the long story short, our central nervous system's job is to assess what are our chances of survival at any given time, and what do we do about it to increase those odds all the time. So when our proprioceptive or body position sense stimuli going into the brain matches our other senses and all the other information that we have, and our central nervous system says, hey, things are okay, I got a good chance of survival, then our outgoing information or our prioritization of our central nervous system functions and how we tell the rest of the body to work operates a certain way. Everything's cool. We can focus on digestion. We can rest. We can be calm. We can have good sleep. We can focus in class. We can do a good job at work. We can chill out and relax with our friends. If there is, though, however, a dissonance between our proprioceptive inputs or our emotion, position, tone, and therefore then the information going into the brain regarding that plus all the rest of those internal or incoming stimuli to the brain, if that stuff doesn't agree, or if there's any shred of doubt within the central nervous system about how safe we are, what are our chances of survival, or overall the resting state of tension within the nervous system, then we have a different way that the central nervous system tells the body how to operate. Most of us know that as fight or flight mode. We in healthcare refer to that as sympathetic drive. So we shift our autonomic nervous system, or the automatic stuff, over to the adrenal side where it kicks in and really just essentially shifts our physiology from everything's fine, we're cool here, to, oh my goodness, I need to survive the next 30 seconds. So things like digestion are off, focus is off. In fact, in that situation, we no longer prioritize our cognition or our thinking based on fact-based learning, but it's now shifted to emotion. So we have challenges with schoolwork, integration with other people, we have problems with sensory inputs, all sorts of things can take place. And this is very apparent in what we see in a lot of school-age kids. So what happens now as we lose that proprioceptive input? Don't get too tied up in the terms that are going to appear here on the page, but just understand what could go on when those are affected. So when the nociception, or the bad noise, the white noise going on in the central nervous system about, hey, things just aren't right, that nociception affects a lot of different areas of the central nervous system. As it says here, the amygdala, which is a stress and anxiety center, makes sense for a lot of kids in the symptoms that they present with. The hippocampus, which mediates and modulates fact-based learning. The frontal cortex, so we talk about behavior and expression, personality, decision-making, moderating social behavior. And then further on down to the bottom, it shows how we really ramp up that adrenal activity. So as it gets in through that HPA axis, the hypothalamus into the pituitary, then into the adrenals, where we get into simply just that fight or flight mode, where we're simply not at rest and not calm. So as we move forward then, we got stuck. That was the first step, that dyskinesia. Second step now is disafferentation. Afferentation just means ingoing information to the brain. So things got stuck, and now the information going to the brain is not what it should be. Then our brain uses that, as I just explained, to decide on how we move forward from here. So dysautonomia. Autonomia is the automatic stuff that goes on. So the balance and prioritization of how we should move forward from this point. How safe are we, and what should we do about that? And as Bruce Lipton, one of my favorite neurological, the father of epigenetics, says, you can't be in growth and protection at the same time, meaning you can't be stuck in that fight or flight mode and be cool, calm, and collected when it comes to work and school and those types of things. And then again, remembering digestion, sleep, an adult sex drive, all big stuff. We can't be in growth and protection at the same time. It's one or the other. And so we get this imbalance in the autonomics, or the balance of our automatic functioning of our central nervous system, due to that increased nociceptive input, decreased proprioceptive input. So again, stuck, bad information going in or incomplete information going in, and now our brain is making different decisions based on that. So what happens then is when it comes into executing a response to those incoming stimuli, that 11 million pieces of information per second, we get into this concept of dyskinesis, which the best way to describe this is faulty resource management. So really what comes down to is your central nervous system really doesn't know the best way to go about it. So we just start chucking resources out there, throwing resources out. So what we end up with is often an over response to many situations. And then finally, what happens then is that we don't have an adequate or appropriate interaction between us and our outside world. There's things that we can't fully integrate and respond to in a manner that is appropriate or expected for the situation. So an example of this is a 16-year-old that started in our office a while back, and he's a really good example because of the impact that the stress on his nervous system had on his life. He responded very, very well. But so he had a very traumatic birth, came in with anxiety and lots of sleep issues. He told me at 16 years old, he's never had a good night's sleep, ever, not once. Poor concentration at school. Obviously, if you don't sleep, you can't concentrate. But then also he had that level of anxiety and just the inability to formulate consistent thought processes and patterns that went forward in a straightforward manner. So things would jump around, he would get frustrated quickly, and then obviously the diagnoses of learning disabilities, and then therefore the feelings that come with that, and feeling that your brain doesn't work the same as anybody else's, that you're not intelligent, that you're not able to do those things. That's where Michael started. So we were able to go through our assessment and find some really key areas in his spine and nervous system where there was a significant load of stress. And our job isn't to diagnose any of the things that we see here on the screen, as far as the disorders or anything other than which areas of the spine and nervous system aren't working as they should, and what can we do about it. That's our job as chiropractors. So we know the neurological impacts of that, but all we can do is say, hey, what's not working right, and what do we do? So we were able to identify through old school chiropractic with palpation, hey, these areas seem really, really stuck and not working correctly. But then we also in our office use a few different ways on how we can measure spine and nervous system function from the outside, non-invasively, in an objective outcome measure fashion, meaning that we can do that at the beginning, go through a course of care, measure it again, and see the changes. Because we can't really predict changes in symptoms. However, we know what we do, and we do it well. So we know that if things aren't working right, and we go through this series of interventions and make them work better, then we should be able to measure that change. And what we see many, many times is that as we measure that positive change in the central nervous system function, we see a correlated positive change in the symptoms associated with it. So Michael started here. This is an EMG and two ways of looking at the graph of this one test that we did. So on top is the amplitude view, and on the bottom is the pattern view. Really what we're looking at here in an EMG is we want to measure the best analogy of this is we want to measure how my central nervous system thinks that what do I need to do just to hold myself upright in a weight-bearing environment under gravity at rest. So Michael's sitting there, we measure the amount of energy given off by the muscles at 15 spots moving top to bottom. And what we expect to see with this in a normal presentation is symmetry, so left and right should match. We want to see a certain pattern. There's a normal pattern of muscle activation at rest that you should demonstrate. And then also the resting amount of energy that we give off should be within a normal, predictable range. And the three metrics are shown down there at the bottom underneath the pattern graph, which most likely you can't see because it's going to be pretty small. But the total amount of energy that a person should give off in this test, right around 100. Teenage boys maybe will give you 130, maybe even 150. But Michael's initial score was just over 1,000, 1,006. So almost 10 times the normal of energy output. So we're measuring microvolts or millions of volts of energy output from the surface of the skin as we measured from top to bottom. So this EMG, the electromyography, is really similar technology to what we use with EKG for your heart or EEG for your brain. This is surface electromyography. So his total score, 1,000 at the beginning. How well he matched the normal pattern of distribution as a percentage, Michael got 20%. And then symmetry, how well left and right matched, we are at 45%. So we put this together, formulated a plan of action with Michael, and got to work. The plan was a little bit longer. Michael's been around. He's 16 years old. Some of these things have been in there, we can only presume, since birth. We assessed him at 16 years old. We don't know when these things came about, but given the history, Michael was also a rugby player, so he's probably picked up a few things along the way, but a hugely traumatic birth most likely had a lot to do with it at the beginning. So when a pattern's stuck that way for a long time, it may take longer. It will take longer to clear. So we laid out a plan and got to work with Michael. We then reassessed at a frequency after his 12th adjustment. So about a month in for Michael. What we were able to see here is a significant reduction in how things were working. So again, at the top, we see this picture of where we measured, the values that we found, the little bars there. If a reading is within the normal range, it'll show up as a little white bar. And then standard deviations outside the researched allowable range of normal at that level causes things to go green, blue, red, mild, moderate, severe. So we saw a lot less than what happened before. And if you look at the bottom, the pattern graph there was tremendously better. The black line actually stays on the page and is starting to match up with the white normal line that we see below it. Long story short, with Michael, he was able to achieve, we're down to 140 with the total energy and the pattern score of about 75% and symmetry of 70% now. So huge gains for Michael. Best sleep of his life, more energy, and overall just better performance at school. So this is a good example of what can go on when we assess, see how this nervous system is working, identify those areas where things aren't working as they're supposed to, where they're stuck, fixated motion within the spine, limiting the information to the brain, therefore limiting the ability of the central nervous system to do its job and integrating those millions of pieces of information and telling the rest of your body how it should interact with your environment. When this happens correctly, things work really, really well. If things are not working correctly in the spine and there's stress on the nervous system, then we see that in how well you are able to integrate with your environment. So hopefully this answers a couple questions that you may have on the neurology, the nerdy side of what impact dysfunction within the spine can have on higher learning, the ability to stay calm, the ability to focus, and the ability to just feel good in your own skin. If you have any questions on this, feel free to comment below, reach out through Messenger, give us a call, text us, whatever you need to do to get the information you need to make the best decisions for your family. Hopefully this was some good value for you. We'll see you soon.